And time now for the France 24 debate. And hello and welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Annette Young, filling in for François Picard. Now, the waves of yesterday's bombings in the Russian city of St. Petersburg continue to reverberate. A native of Kyrgyzstan who had Russian citizenship is believed to be responsible for the deadly blast in Vladimir Putin's hometown. 14 people were killed and more than 50 others injured as the explosion ripped apart a train in the city's underground metro system. Emerald Maxwell has more on what we know so far about that attack.
Russian authorities have said that a suicide bomber was behind the attack. They say they identified him after finding his remains in one of the train carriages. Earlier, Kyrgyzstan's intelligence agency, which is cooperating with Russian investigators, named a Kyrgyz-born Russian citizen as a suspect. Although authorities are treating the bombing as an act of terrorism, there has been no official link to Islamist radicals. Kyrgyzstan is a former Soviet republic which gained independence in 1991, but it remains economically dependent on Russia, with many Kyrgyz moving there for work. Although some obtain Russian citizenship, many remain marginalized, becoming ripe targets for Islamist recruitment. Across the country, Russians have been paying their respects to the victims of Monday's attack, on the first day of 3 days of mourning.
I believe this action was aimed at scaring people, but we should not give in to fear, and I think we should be alert and react to suspicious behavior.
We have special services that deal with this. The perpetrators cannot escape retribution. I believe that, and therefore I'm not afraid.
Investigators say they're looking into the fact that Russian President Vladimir Putin was in St. Petersburg when the attack took place. They've reopened Syria Square metro station after it was closed following a new bomb threat.
So, was Monday's attack the beginning of a new wave of terrorism in Russia? With me to discuss this is Cyril Brett, the co-founder of Eurasia Perspective, Julian Thiron, a political scientist and specialist on the Middle East. And from Moscow, we've got Mark Sloboda, an international affairs and security analyst. Also from Moscow, we have Ekaterina Sokyrianskaya from the International Crisis Group. Cyril, let me start with you. Would you agree that Russia is fast becoming the #1 enemy of Sunni jihadist groups, given that it's upped its involvement in the Syrian conflict?
#1, I wouldn't say, but probably one of the most targeted country in the month and the years to come. Because of the, of course, of the course of action that Russia has taken in Syria and in the Middle East 2 years ago, of course, but probably also because of the general political course that the Putin regime has taken concerning the Muslim population, and especially the Muslim populations in the Caucasus. We have to bear in mind that from a merely political and cynical point of view, unrest in Caucasus has fostered the implementation of a new kind of political regime in Russia at the turning point of 1999 and 2000.
Cyril, it seems to be that a lot of intention in the past in Russia has been on Islamists from the North Caucasus region, but we're now sort of getting a situation developing in Central Asia. And is Kyrgyzstan, as a result, becoming much more of a threat?
Well, I do agree. I think that Russia is under threat, but it's not new, actually, because since the second Chechen war, they knew a lot of different terror attacks, especially 2004, a Black Year, for instance. And now it continues with the different outputs. What is true is that the radicalization of Chechen and Dagestanese citizens, Russian citizens, actually maintained a threat to Russia since since this period, and we know that a lot of them actually joined ISIS or Al-Qaeda since then. So, I mean, there's a maintaining presence of Islamic jihadism in Caucasus. And what is new, actually, is the fact that Russia is really afraid of the spread of ISIS in Central Asia, like you said. This pushes, apparently, Russia to work with the Taliban in Afghanistan to prevent the rise of ISIS in the global region, which is a direct threat through the near or broad region to Russia.
Mark, in Moscow, Central Asia has been in the past seen to be the sort of buffer zone between Russia and Afghanistan, and now appears to be becoming, as we've just been saying, a breeding ground for radical Islamists.
Well, I think it has been a breeding ground for radical Islamists for a long time. Indeed, back to the days that the United States, Pakistan, and other Western countries were arming, training, and salarying the mujahideen in Afghanistan to overthrow the socialist government of Afghanistan. That was part of the precipitator that the Soviet Union was so worried about, that this radical Islam being promoted in that country with the hopes of overthrowing the government in a Cold War geopolitical struggle would exacerbate the ethno-religious tensions in the region, and more particularly lead to the furthering of this rather hateful ideological strain of Wahhabism or Salafism, which I think in all discussions of this we need to separate from the rest of Islam.
Now, Katerina, the suspect may have been born in Kyrgyzstan, but he had been living in Russia for some time. Just how much of an internal threat is Russia facing?
Excuse me, how much of an external threat is...
Internal. How much of an internal threat domestically is Russia facing?
Oh, right. Well, there is a very serious security challenge related to terrorism and ISIS-associated terrorism in Russia, mainly in the North Caucasus. And in the recent years, it's been contained to the North Caucasus primarily. I mean, we should remember that attacks in the North Caucasus continue. Of course, the intensity in the last couple of years is much lower, but they still take place on a regular basis. And since 2015, the remains of the North Caucasus insurgency has swore allegiance to al-Baghdadi, so they're now fighting under the banner of the Islamic State. And we do have sympathizers of ISIS ideology in big Russian cities, in Siberia, in the Volga-Ural region. People leave for Syria and Iraq, so the internal threat is significant.
But Ekaterina, this particular person came from Kyrgyzstan, and Russia, as we know, has many Central Asian migrants who themselves face much discrimination in the same way that the Hispanic population does in the US. So I'm just, with that in mind, as a result, not just mentioning, because there's two distinct regions which we need to make clear to the viewer, how much of a threat is Russia facing from homegrown terrorists, effectively?
You mean related to the Central Asian migrants?
Yes.
Or generally?
Oh, and generally.
Well, Central Asian migrants constitute a significant number of Muslims in the Russian big cities. This is a marginalized and discriminated population, category of citizen. They are prone to radicalization. At the same time, I wouldn't like to say that Central Asian migrants represent a threat to Russia. There's we haven't had a history of any major attacks committed by Central Asians in Russia. And I think at the moment it's really quite dangerous to link this to phenomena, because this can result in very strong anti-migrant campaigns. And I think one of the aims of this terrorist act and the reasons why it was committed by a person with Central Asian origin is to exactly provoke anti-migrant sentiments, which are already strong in the Russian big cities. And since Russia is at the moment entering this period of turbulence with On the one hand, the presidential election, more or less still unofficially, but already started in the last couple of months. And at the same time, protests, anti-corruption protests of long-distance truck drivers. So this is the moment where Russia is vulnerable in a sense. The tensions are growing, and committing a terrorist act in a big city where the president is located by a person with Central Asian origin could exactly, be meant to or aimed to exacerbate this type of tension.
Cyril.
But I wouldn't.
Sorry, at this point, Cyril, you want to say something?
Yes, I fully share the view that the populations from Central Asia are no threats in themselves, of course. But we also have to bear in mind that from a historical point of view, Islam and Russia are deeply intertwined. It's no post-colonial history that has raised or fostered Islam within Russia. Islam has been a full part of the Russian history for many, many centuries, and the Russian population within Russia, the Russian Islamic population within Russia, especially in the region of Kazan, are no foreigners. They are full-fledged Russian citizens, and they didn't express any hatred against the central power just because they are a part of the political system. We have to make a clear distinction between the external threats that are probably linked with the repercussions of the political course of Russia in the Middle East and the question of domestic Islam. We have to bear in mind that 15% of the Russian population is from a Muslim background or Islamic background. When, just a few words, when the Russian authorities present themselves as the spearhead of the Christianity in the Middle East or the defenders of Christianity on the world stage, it's an ideological construction which is based upon the oblivion of the fact that Islam is a part of Russia and cannot be presented as an external threat to Russia.
Julian.
Yeah, by the way, Vladimir Putin tried to organize a summit regarding to Islam, and what was interesting is that he did not invite actually people from the Gulf, not to represent Wahhabism, which is a traditionalism in Islam. So he tried, after the intervention in Syria and these pictures of popes giving a blessing to missiles and so on, and these talks about the Holy Crusade and so on. He tried to counterbalance, then to organize precisely to stop any kind of possible unrest from the Muslim population within Russia.
At this point, I just want to go back to Ekaterina. Ekaterina, you work for the International Crisis Group, and in a report, your organisation says Moscow wanted to eradicate the risk of domestic terror attacks. So intelligence and police officials turned a blind eye to Islamic militants leaving the country, with some sources saying that officials even encouraged militants to leave. Just tell us a little bit more about this particular strategy and what the ICG uncovered.
This was allegedly a strategy before the Sochi Olympics, Winter Olympics in Sochi, which took place in 2014. At that time, approximately 1 year before the Sochi Olympics, the North Caucasus, which is located in close proximity to Sochi, was still a full-fledged conflict zone with attacks, suicide attacks, clashes happening at least weekly, sometimes more often. Moreover, the leader of the Caucasus Emirate, the terrorist organization, Islamist organization, which was operating in the North Caucasus at that time, directly threatened to disrupt the Olympics with all means available, and they tried to commit terrorist acts around Sochi, as we know. So the Russian authorities were facing a huge security challenge to a major international event, and they had to very quickly take under control the terrorism-related risks. So they carried out hundreds of law enforcement security operations, killing leaders, rank and file, crashing insurgency on the ground, basically. On the one hand, this was part of the strategy. And the second part was allegedly to basically at least close a blind eye, if not encouraging radicals to leave Russia. And at that time, this very attractive to ultra-radical ISIS jihadist project appeared, and they were doing their own very effective propaganda on the Russian jihadists. So this was combined, in a sense, and produced a major outflow of radicals from the North Caucasus. Officially, it's around 3,000, and the security services say it could be up to 5,000 Russian citizens fighting in Syria and Iraq. Most of them come from the North Caucasus. So in addition to kind of encouraging this outflow, the security services criminalized participation in armed groups abroad, which contradicts the interests of the Russian Federation, which means that you can fight in Ukraine but not in Syria or in Iraq. And they made the sentences, increased the sentences. So if somebody wants to come back now, the security services are waiting for them at the border, and they would immediately arrest them, which basically they sealed off the border to an extent. This strategy, however, almost immediately after the Sochi Olympics, and the government started, the law enforcement started to prevent the outflow.
Mark Sloboda from Moscow, given what you've just heard there from Ekaterina, that is an extraordinary strategy for the Russian government to take. And is it not the case that it really has failed in a way?
Well, I think it's definitely an extraordinary conspiracy theory, and an extraordinarily vile one. I think certainly we can blame the Russian government, along with all the governments of Western Europe, for turning a blind eye to jihadists who traveled to Syria to fight in a jihad to overthrow the Syrian government. Certainly, there are numerous Western officials that in the first years of the conflict said they have every legal right to go there. There was certainly no attempt to stop them in the first years of the conflict. Indeed, the only worry there was that whatever they do while they're there was no concern. But the fear was that they would eventually come back. And indeed, we have seen them come back. We have seen them come back and commit terrorist acts in Europe. And when we're speaking also of immigrants, immigrants in Russia, we're talking about the Central Asian population, both, that was born here and the migrant labor. There's no question that they face a degree of discrimination in Russian society, a small degree, something that's quite different from what the Soviet Union was. But this is no more severe than the discrimination that we see in Western countries against their own Muslim populations, both immigrant and born there. And in fact, that's borne out by the number of terrorist attacks that have been committed in Paris, in London, in Germany, and others, committed not by foreigners, but by citizens or residents of those countries. These are these same disenfranchised, demonized migrants, but it's quite one thing to blame Russia for it, and quite another thing to acknowledge that that's happening in our own Western countries.
What is interesting is that it has not been claimed yet by ISIS, but clearly speaking, ISIS counts on these kind of foreign fighters coming from Western Europe, from Central Asia, from Russia, because it gives them assets to strike these areas afterwards. And what we have said, meaning that a lot of this Islamic Emirate of the Caucasus came and grew the ranks of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and now there's a lot of Central Asian over there, going there. The figures are not fixed, but there's a lot of them, and meaning that, in a way, what happened in Caucasus was not ruled out, and now is propagating in Central Asia. So it's clearly a new ISIS strategy. One of ISIS leaders said last year that they will transform their strategy. So regarding to their territory, they decrease, but regarding to the foreign action, they're still maintaining the pressure.
I'm afraid we're going to have to just press the pause button there, because this is the end of the first part of the France 24 debate. Do stay with us, because after a short break, we'll be back with the second part.